There's a mountain in central Iran that the United States has been staring at through satellites for over a year, waiting for exactly one thing to happen inside it, and intelligence assessments now suggest Iran finally went ahead and did it anyway. It's August 17th, everybody. Welcome back to the video. Hope you're doing great wherever you're tuning in from today. Here's what we're covering. Pickaxe Mountain, the most fortified nuclear site Iran has ever built. The one facility that survived last year's strikes completely untouched. And the new intelligence suggesting Iran just moved the exact thing the US military has spent months publicly saying it's watching for. We're going to walk through what this site actually is, why it was left standing when everything around it got hit, and what this development means for what happens next. Before we get into all of that, stick around, because about 3/4 of the way through the video we're heading over to the Global Desk Roundup, and Ukraine just launched one of the largest drone barrages of this entire war, hundreds of them aimed straight at Moscow. So stay tuned for that. Let's rewind to where this all started, because the backstory matters here more than usual. Back in June of last year, the United States joined Israel in a 12-day war against Iran that culminated in a strike campaign the Pentagon called Operation Midnight Hammer. 3 sites got hit that night: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, Iran's primary uranium enrichment facilities, using 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs called massive ordnance penetrators, specifically built to punch through deeply buried, hardened targets. Trump stood in front of cameras afterward and said Iran's nuclear capabilities had been completely and totally obliterated. Big statement, dramatic language, the kind of line that gets clipped and replayed for months. But here's the thing that a lot of people missed at the time, and it's the entire foundation of the story we're covering tonight. There was a 4th site. A site sitting just a few miles from Natanz, dug deep into a mountain, under construction for years, and it wasn't hit. Not during Operation Midnight Hammer, not during the renewed war that kicked off again this past February. That site is called Pickaxe Mountain, known in Iran as Ku-i-Kolangazla, and it has become, by a wide margin, the single most important unanswered question in this entire conflict. Here's what we actually know about the place. The complex sits on the south side of the Natanz nuclear facility, buried somewhere in the neighborhood of 328 feet beneath a mountain that itself rises more than 5,000 feet above sea level. Satellite imagery from the Institute for Science and International Security has tracked ongoing construction at multiple tunnel entrances for well over a year now, including reinforced concrete headworks being added to at least one entrance, specifically designed to allow for additional overburden, meaning more rock, more soil, more concrete piled on top, to make the tunnel even harder to penetrate from the air. Analysts who've been tracking this site closely have pointed out that construction didn't slow down after the strikes on Iran's other nuclear facilities last year. It accelerated. Whatever Iran is building at Pickaxe Mountain, they've been building it faster since the rest of their nuclear infrastructure got flattened around it, not slower. And that's exactly the kind of behavior that gets a facility promoted to the very top of a target list. Think about it from a purely logical standpoint. If your enrichment sites keep getting bombed and one facility keeps getting reinforced instead of abandoned, that facility isn't a leftover construction project anymore. It's where you're planning to put everything that survives. There's a detail in the imagery analysis worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something about the mindset behind this whole project. At one of the eastern tunnel entrances, analysts noted that rock and soil had been deliberately pushed back and leveled directly on top of the tunnel portal, essentially burying the entrance under an additional layer of natural cover rather than just sealing it with a door or a gate. That's not standard construction practice for a mining operation or a conventional industrial site. That's the kind of camouflage and hardening work you do when you've specifically studied how an adversary identifies and targets buried facilities from the air, and you're trying to make your own site blend into the surrounding terrain as much as physically possible. Combine that with the reinforced concrete headworks added to other entrances, and you're looking at a facility that's been actively upgraded, entrance by entrance, in direct response to lessons learned from watching Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan get hit. Which brings us to the actual news that's driving this entire story right now. The Wall Street Journal reported, citing Israeli intelligence assessments, that Iran transferred nuclear centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium up toward weapons grade levels, into Pickaxe Mountain sometime last fall. Centrifuges. Not raw materials sitting in storage, not construction equipment, the actual machinery required to take Iran's existing stockpile of enriched uranium and push it further towards something usable in a weapon. When Trump got asked directly whether he believed that report, he didn't deny it. They may have, we don't have it on record, he said. Then, almost begrudgingly, maybe this one they have right. That's about as close as you'll ever get to a sitting president confirming a classified intelligence assessment without technically confirming it. Notice, too, how carefully Trump hedged even that partial confirmation, pairing it in the same breath with the reminder that the material itself, the actual enriched uranium stockpile, is what ultimately matters more than any single piece of machinery. That's not an accident either. It's a president trying to walk a narrow line in public, acknowledging enough to justify the pressure campaign already underway without fully tipping his hand on exactly what the intelligence community knows or how confident they are in it. A pretty familiar pattern for anyone who's followed how this administration has talked about classified material throughout this entire war. And this is where the title of this video actually comes from. Because for months, Trump's public position on Pickaxe Mountain has been strikingly consistent, almost repetitive in a way that, in hindsight, looks a lot less like indecision and a lot more like a deliberate holding pattern. And we follow the material, he told reporters more than once. That's where the action is. On a separate occasion, talking about the site specifically, he put it even more bluntly. We're watching it closely. We see no activity there. They're not doing well with their nuclear situation. Every time we hear about it, we blow it up. So they don't like talking about it. Read that quote again, because it's doing a lot of work. The US wasn't threatening to strike Pickaxe Mountain because it existed. Plenty of hardened, buried facilities exist all over Iran that haven't been hit. The US was explicitly waiting to see what Iran actually did with it, waiting for movement, waiting for material, waiting for the kind of activity that turns a construction site into an active, weapons-relevant target under any reasonable interpretation of international law. And now, according to the best available intelligence, Iran finally gave them exactly that. Let's be clear about what makes this moment different from every other "Iran did something provocative" headline this war has produced. There have been dozens of those already. Tanker seizures, drone swarms, missile barrages, mine drops in the Strait. Every single one of those got absorbed into the broader rhythm of this conflict. A strike here, a counterstrike there, the cycle grinding forward without fundamentally shifting the terms of the fight. This is different because it doesn't touch the war's day-to-day rhythm at all. It touches the one question that was always going to define how this entire conflict gets judged after it's over, whether Iran actually still had a path to a bomb, and whether the world's most expensive and most technically demanding military campaign, in a generation, actually closed that path or just relocated it somewhere harder to reach. Let's talk about why centrifuges specifically matter so much here, because I don't think casual observers always appreciate the distinction. Iran is believed to be sitting on somewhere close to 1,000 pounds of uranium enriched to nearly 60% purity, according to assessments from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Weapons-grade material generally starts around 90%. So Iran isn't sitting on a finished bomb's worth of material, not even close on its own, but 60% is a lot closer to 90 than it is to the roughly 5% enrichment level used in civilian power reactors. The distance left to cover isn't a massive technical leap. It's a matter of running that existing stockpile back through enrichment centrifuges for a relatively short additional stretch, which means the centrifuges themselves, wherever they physically sit, are functionally the bottleneck standing between what Iran already has and what it would need to actually build a weapon. Take out the enrichment sites, and you can slow that process down dramatically even if the raw material survives somewhere else. That's the entire logic behind why Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan got hit last year in the first place. And it's exactly why a report saying Iran quietly moved its remaining centrifuges into the one facility that never got touched should be setting off alarm bells anywhere serious people are tracking this conflict. It's also worth understanding just how much uncertainty still surrounds what kind of centrifuges we're even talking about here, because that detail changes the timeline significantly. Iran's older generation machines, the IR-1 models it's operated for years, are notoriously inefficient, requiring huge cascades of thousands of units running for extended periods to meaningfully move material toward weapons grade. But Iran has also spent years developing far more advanced designs, the IR-6 and beyond, which can enrich uranium several times faster per machine. Nuclear policy analysts have pointed out that there's a real open question about which generation of centrifuges actually survived last year's strikes, and how many of them made it into Pickaxe Mountain intact. If it's a modest number of older, slower machines, Iran's timeline back toward a weapons-capable stockpile could still be measured in many months. If a meaningful cluster of the newer, faster generation made the move instead, that timeline compresses considerably, and that uncertainty alone is a huge part of why nobody serious is treating this as a slow-moving story anymore. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Director General, Rafael Grossi, has been dealing with a much bigger problem underneath all of this, too. And it's one that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Iran hasn't allowed IAEA inspectors anywhere near Pickaxe Mountain, not once. Grossi has publicly acknowledged that Iran declared all the way back in 2021 an intention to conduct nuclear activity at the site. But since then, the agency has had zero independent verification of what's actually happening inside those tunnels. No inspections, no access, no way to confirm centrifuge counts, production levels, or enrichment activity through any means other than satellite imagery and classified intelligence assessments from allied governments. Grossi has separately noted that roughly 200 kilograms of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile is believed to be stored in deep tunnels near Isfahan, and that additional quantities are believed to be tied to the fortified complex Iran built at Pickaxe Mountain specifically. When the world's nuclear watchdog is reduced to guessing based on satellite photos of a tunnel entrance because the country in question simply won't let anyone in the door, that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Iran is treating this particular facility, and how much they clearly understand is riding on keeping it hidden. Grossi's inspectors have run into the exact same wall at other Iranian sites in the past, and it's worth remembering that even before this current war reignited in February, the agency had already flagged unresolved questions about undeclared nuclear material at multiple locations across the country going back years. Pickaxe Mountain isn't really a new pattern of Iranian behavior. It's the most extreme version yet of a pattern that international inspectors have been documenting and complaining about for the better part of a decade. A country that consistently keeps its most sensitive nuclear activity just far enough outside the reach of independent verification that nobody outside its own government can say with total certainty what's actually happening inside. Now let's talk about what happens on the other side of this, because Iran hasn't exactly been quiet about the consequences either. After Trump's public threats to strike the site, Iran's top joint military command, the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, put out a statement warning that any American attack on Iranian nuclear facilities would be treated as, in their words, an expansion of the war in the region. That's not a subtle warning. That's Iran explicitly drawing a line and telling the United States, and by extension everyone else watching this conflict, that a strike on Pickaxe Mountain specifically crosses into a different category of escalation than the strikes that have already been happening constantly for months. Which, if you think about it, is a little bit of an admission in itself. If the site really were just an empty tunnel complex with nothing of consequence inside it, that kind of dramatic warning wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, would it? You don't threaten to expand a war over an empty hole in a mountain. Here's the strategic picture as it actually stands right now. The U.S. destroyed Iran's 3 primary enrichment facilities last year with the most powerful conventional bunker-busting weapons in its arsenal. Iran responded, according to the best available intelligence, by quietly relocating its most valuable surviving equipment into the one facility specifically engineered from the ground up to survive exactly that kind of strike. That's not Iran hiding from a threat that already passed. That's Iran actively building a fallback position it clearly always intended to use the moment its other options got taken away. And the fact that construction accelerated after the June strikes instead of slowing down tells you Iranian planners saw this exact scenario coming from a mile away and prepared for it in advance. Whether you view that as smart contingency planning or damning evidence of ongoing weapons intent probably depends a lot on which side of this conflict you're rooting for. But either way, it's hard to argue Iran didn't know exactly what it was doing when it built that place. It's also worth pausing on what this whole situation says about the limits of even the most successful conventional strike campaign in modern history. Operation Midnight Hammer was, by nearly every technical measure, a remarkable success. 3 heavily defended, deeply buried nuclear sites hit in a single coordinated operation with precision. Most militaries on Earth simply don't have access to. And yet here we are, more than a year later, talking about a 4th site that may end up housing everything those first 3 strikes were supposed to permanently take off the table. That's not a knock on the operation itself. It's a reminder that air power alone, no matter how precise or how powerful, can only ever address the facilities you know about and are willing to hit. It can't fully close a program down if the other side has spent that same year quietly building somewhere new to put what's left. And there's a reason the location itself was chosen so deliberately too. Sitting a mountain range like that, with hundreds of feet of solid rock and reinforced concrete stacked on top of the actual working space, isn't something you engineer by accident. Whoever designed Pickaxe Mountain studied exactly what kind of ordnance the United States used against Fordo and built specifically to survive an even harder version of that same attack. Reinforced tunnel headworks, additional overburden piled on top of existing entrances, multiple access points spread across the mountain rather than a single vulnerable choke point. This is a facility designed by people who assumed, correctly as it turns out, that their other sites were going to get hit eventually, and who wanted somewhere left standing afterward that could keep the program alive, regardless of what happened everywhere else. Think about the sheer institutional patience that takes too. This wasn't a rushed, last-minute decision made in a panic after the first bombs started falling. Construction at Pickaxe Mountain has been documented for well over a year, meaning Iranian planners started building their contingency facility long before the current phase of the war even began, betting from the outset that their declared enrichment sites would eventually be hit and building a fallback specifically for that scenario. That's not the behavior of a country hoping for the best. That's the behavior of a country that fully expected to lose Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan and planned years in advance for exactly what to do afterward. So what does the US actually do about a target like this? That's the question everyone in the defense community has been chewing on for weeks now, and there isn't a clean, easy answer. The same massive ordnance penetrators used against Fordo were specifically built for deeply buried targets, and Fordo itself sits roughly 260 feet underground, which gives you a rough sense of what these weapons are capable of punching through. Pickaxe Mountain's depth, at roughly 328 feet with additional reinforced overburden layered on top of that, sits meaningfully deeper than Fordo did. And every additional layer of rock and concrete Iran has added, since construction accelerated, only makes that math harder. It's entirely possible that hitting this site effectively requires multiple penetrator strikes stacked directly on top of each other, each one punching slightly deeper than the last, a tactic that's been discussed in defense circles as a way to defeat exactly this kind of layered, reinforced underground target. That's not a single clean strike with a nice press conference afterward. That's a sustained, multi-hit operation that carries real risk of failing to fully collapse the structure even after everything gets thrown at it. There's also the question of exactly what a partial success looks like here, and that's a scenario planners have to take just as seriously as outright failure. If a strike collapses the tunnel entrances but doesn't fully destroy the working space deeper inside the mountain, you've sealed the facility rather than eliminated it, buying time rather than solving the underlying problem permanently. Iran, given enough months and enough labor, could theoretically dig new access points from a different angle of the same mountain, especially given how much of the surrounding rock has already been mapped and tunneled through during years of ongoing construction. That's part of why some analysts have pushed for a preemptive strike sooner rather than later, arguing that the facility only gets harder to fully neutralize the longer construction and reinforcement continue, and that waiting for even more certainty risks waiting until the site becomes functionally immune to anything short of a nuclear-capable bunker buster, an escalation nobody in Washington is remotely prepared to consider. And that's before you even get to the geopolitical side of the equation. Because remember, this entire war has already dragged in Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and effectively the entire Persian Gulf shipping industry through the ongoing blockade fight. Iran's own military command has explicitly said a strike on its nuclear infrastructure specifically would be treated as crossing into new territory. So any decision to actually go after Pickaxe Mountain isn't just a targeting problem for munitions planners. It's a decision that has to account for exactly how much wider Iran might be willing to push this conflict in response, at a moment when regional partners are already stretched thin defending against near-constant retaliatory strikes on their own soil. But here's why I think this specific development, Iran actually moving centrifuges into the site, rather than just continuing to build it out, changes the calculus in a way that months of construction alone never did. Construction is ambiguous. You can argue about intent, about civilian versus military purpose, about whether a tunnel complex is just Iranian paranoia after getting bombed or something more deliberate. Moving actual enrichment centrifuges into a facility the IAEA has never been allowed to inspect is not ambiguous in the same way. That's an action with a single, obvious purpose, and it's exactly the kind of concrete material development that turns a years-long standoff over an unconfirmed construction project into something with a much clearer justification attached to it. Trump didn't say we're going to hit Pickaxe Mountain because it exists. He said we follow the material. Iran just gave the United States military the material to follow, and every week that report goes unchallenged by Tehran, the pressure on Washington to act on it only builds further. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a like on the video. It genuinely helps get deeper analysis like this in front of more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening here instead of just catching a 15-second headline clip. And if you've got thoughts on whether the US should be striking a site this deep and this uncertain, drop them in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of decision where reasonable people land in very different places. You made it to the Global Desk Roundup, my friend. Let's talk about what else is happening around the world right now. First stop, and this one's a big one. Ukraine just launched one of the largest aerial drone attacks of the entire war, sending roughly 600 drones toward the Moscow region in a single overnight barrage. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed it destroyed more than 800 Ukrainian drones across the country as a whole, while Moscow's own mayor confirmed that a couple hundred of those 600 were specifically intercepted over the Moscow region itself. Not all of them got stopped, though. An elderly man was killed when a drone struck a private home outside the city, and a Ukrainian strike set fire to a massive logistics warehouse belonging to one of Russia's largest e-commerce retailers, sending smoke pouring over the region for hours. Russian state media described it as the largest Ukrainian drone attack aimed at the capital since the start of the year, and a huge chunk of the drones were specifically routed toward areas where a lot of Russia's elite reside, which is not exactly a subtle message to send. Meanwhile, Russia wasn't sitting still either, launching its own wave of missiles and drones back at Ukraine overnight, hitting Kyiv directly, including a strike on a book market in the capital that sparked fires firefighters were still working to put out as the sun came up, along with strikes on a steel plant that killed workers and wounded over a dozen more. On top of all of that, a NATO F-18 flying an air policing mission over Romania shot down a drone that crossed into Romanian airspace from neighboring Moldova during the same chaotic overnight window. The latest in a growing list of incidents where this war has spilled directly into NATO territory rather than staying neatly contained inside Ukraine's own borders. Casualty numbers on both sides kept climbing through the night, too. Ukrainian officials confirmed strikes across more than a dozen separate locations, with fatalities reported in Kyiv itself, in Kryvyi Rih, and in the northeastern city of Sumy, while Ukraine's president used the moment to make yet another public appeal to Western partners for more air defense interceptors, pointing out bluntly that European stockpiles sitting unused in storage aren't protecting anyone while they stay there. It's the same resource math we've talked about extensively on this channel in a completely different theater. Expensive, finite interceptor stocks trying to keep pace with cheap, mass-produced drones and missiles fired in overwhelming numbers, and neither side of this war shows any sign of easing off that approach anytime soon. Second stop, over in the South China Sea, where a quieter but genuinely significant dispute has been heating up between the Philippines and China. The Philippines formally deposited an official nautical chart with the United Nations, establishing baselines around Scarborough Shoal, a contested reef claimed by China, the Philippines, and Taiwan all at once, sitting roughly 220 kilometers off the coast of Luzon Island. China's foreign ministry wasted no time rejecting the move outright, calling it illegal and invalid, and reiterating Beijing's own claims over the same waters. Taiwan, for its part, weighed in separately too, reaffirming its own historical claims in the region while stopping short of actively pressing them, and specifically calling for Taipei to be included in whatever multilateral mechanisms eventually get used to settle these overlapping disputes. It's a reminder that even with the entire world's attention locked onto the Gulf and onto Ukraine, the long-simmering territorial disputes across the Indo-Pacific haven't gone anywhere. They've just been quietly building in the background. And legal maneuvers like this one over a single reef have a way of eventually forcing much bigger confrontations down the line if nobody finds a way to actually resolve them. China's Coast Guard has already stepped up patrols in waters east of Taiwan through the summer, and analysts tracking the region have pointed out that this kind of gradual incremental pressure, a chart deposited here, a patrol expanded there, is exactly the pattern countries use when they're not looking for an immediate confrontation, but are absolutely positioning themselves for one down the road. That's the roundup for today. Now let's put the pieces together, because I think this one connects in a way that's worth sitting with for a minute. You made it to the 4D chess strategic analysis section, my friend. Here's how I'd frame everything we just covered. For months, the entire Pickaxe Mountain story has existed in a kind of strategic limbo. Trump kept threatening to strike it, kept saying the US was watching, kept repeating that phrase, "We follow the material," over and over in front of cameras. And for months, Iran gave Washington absolutely nothing concrete to act on beyond satellite photos of tunnel construction that, by itself, isn't necessarily proof of anything more sinister than a country trying to protect infrastructure. It's already watched get bombed once. That ambiguity was, in a strange way, protecting the site. As long as there was reasonable doubt about what was actually inside it, striking a deeply buried facility next to a civilian population center carried real diplomatic and legal risk that a rational actor has to weigh carefully. Moving centrifuges into that facility erases that ambiguity in one stroke. It's Iran making a calculated bet that the protection of uncertainty was worth more than the risk of getting caught. And based on what's leaking out through Israeli intelligence channels right now, that bet may not have paid off the way Tehran hoped it would. There's a historical parallel worth bringing up here too, because this isn't the first time a Middle Eastern country has tried to rebuild a nuclear program inside a fortified, deliberately obscured facility after an initial strike. Iraq did something similar after Israel's Osirak strike back in 1981, and Syria tried a version of the same approach before Israel destroyed its own covert reactor in 2007. In both of those cases, the country in question eventually gave the other side enough concrete evidence, whether through intelligence leaks, defector testimony, or satellite imagery, to justify a follow-up strike that finished what the first one started. Pickaxe Mountain increasingly looks like it's tracking toward that exact same pattern. A fortified rebuild attempt that survives the initial round of strikes only to eventually generate the kind of hard evidence that makes a second strike difficult to avoid. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes awfully closely here, and if the pattern holds, the centrifuge transfer report we're discussing tonight may end up looking, in hindsight, like the exact moment that pattern clicked into its next phase. Every other piece of this conflict we've covered on this channel, the naval blockade, The tanker attacks, the directed energy weapons quietly proving themselves in the Gulf, the coordinated strikes across multiple provinces in a single night, all of it has been building toward a single underlying question that never really got resolved. Does Iran still have a credible path back to a nuclear weapon? And if it does, where exactly is it? This development, if it holds up under further scrutiny, doesn't just answer part of that question. It hands the United States something it's been explicitly saying for months it needed before making its next move. And I think that's the piece that makes this story bigger than just one facility buried under one mountain. Every major escalation we've documented on this channel throughout this entire war, the naval blockade tightening, the coordinated multi-province strike nights, the directed energy weapons quietly proving themselves against Iranian drones, has followed a similar shape. Iran makes a move it believes strengthens its position, and that move ends up handing the United States exactly the justification or the capability it needed to escalate further in response. If the centrifuge transfer report holds up, Pickaxe Mountain becomes the latest and arguably the most consequential entry on that list, because unlike a tanker attack or a drone swarm, a decision about striking a nuclear facility doesn't just shape the next news cycle. It shapes how this entire conflict gets remembered years from now, and whether Iran's nuclear ambitions end this war contained or end up being the exact reason it never fully ends at all. What do you all think? Does this change the timeline on when we see an actual strike on Pickaxe Mountain, or does the depth and reinforcement of that site make it too risky to attempt even with a confirmed target inside it? Let me know down in the comments. I want to hear where you land on this one. If you made it this far, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't yet. It genuinely helps a channel like this one keep putting together the kind of deep dive breakdowns you're not going to find in a quick headline scroll. And share this with anyone you know who's been trying to actually follow how this nuclear standoff has been developing, instead of just catching the occasional clip about it. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.